When I reflect upon the story of the Little Prince, I am immediately struck by the powerful presence of the child archetype in my work. I have often described the child as a symbol of potential of the future and of a wholeness that is yet to be realized. The child represents not only vulnerability, but also the promise of renewal, creativity, and connection to the divine spark within the human soul. The Little Prince, in his innocence and curiosity, embodies this archetype completely. He arrives from a distant asteroid, small and seemingly insignificant. Yet he brings with him truths that cut through the illusions of adulthood. He is a reminder that within each of us lives this eternal child, the part that questions dreams and seeks meaning beyond the material. When I consider the aviator, stranded in the desert and weighed down by the concerns of his adult life, I see the contrast between the rational, burdened ego and the timeless voice of the child within. The Little Prince awakens in him, and in us as readers, the forgotten memories of imagination, wonder, and purity. This encounter is no coincidence. In psychological terms, it is the moment when the conscious ego is confronted with a figure from the unconscious, a messenger carrying the wisdom of the self. The desert setting is also deeply symbolic. To me, the desert represents the barren state of the modern soul, dry, emptied of meaning, disconnected from nature, community, and inner truth. And into this emptiness arrives a child, watering the wasteland of the spirit with innocence and questions. It is as if the unconscious sends forth this figure to rescue the ego from its isolation. What does this mean psychologically? It means that the Little Prince is not only a fable for children, but also a myth for adults who have lost touch with the living waters of imagination. It is the story of individuation itself, the process by which the human being integrates the lost parts of the psyche and moves toward wholeness. The child, therefore, is not to be dismissed as naive or weak. On the contrary, the child archetype contains within it the seed of transformation. It is a reminder that new beginnings are always possible, that the soul is never fully extinguished, and that to move forward, we must return to the essence of what was once forgotten. In the figure of the Little Prince, I see not just a boy from another planet, but a universal image of the eternal child who dwells in every soul. He is fragile yet strong, simple yet wise, innocent yet profoundly connected to the mysteries of existence. His presence is an invitation to remember that growth does not mean abandoning the child within, but learning to integrate it into the adult self. The Little Prince's journey begins as a call to all of us to rediscover the child, to confront our deserts, and to recognize that within the smallest and most vulnerable aspect of ourselves lies the key to healing and meaning. As the Little Prince speaks of his rose, we enter one of the most profound psychological layers of the story. The rose is delicate, beautiful, and unique, yet also demanding, proud, and sometimes cruel. To me, this flower embodies the complex nature love as it exists within the psyche, a union of light and shadow, of beauty and suffering, of longing and fear. In my studies, I often emphasize that love, while exalted, is rarely free of projection. When the Little Prince looks at his rose, he sees not only the flower itself, but also the image of his own longing, his desire for purity, and his vulnerability. The rose becomes a mirror, reflecting his inner world, his needs, and his fears. This is what I call projection of the anima, the tendency of the psyche to invest an external figure, often a woman, with the qualities of the inner feminine soul. To the Little Prince, the rose is not just a flower. She is the anima, the embodiment of beauty and mystery, but also of emotional challenge and disappointment. The rose also carries with her the shadow. She is not only fragrant and radiant, but also capricious, manipulative, and frail. Love, in its truest form, always carries a shadow of pain. To love another is to risk suffering, to risk loss, to risk disillusionment. The Little Prince's struggle with the rose mirrors our own psychological struggle. We see perfection in love, yet must confront the imperfections that accompany it. When he leaves his rose, there is both sadness and necessity. Psychologically, this departure represents a painful but essential step of differentiating the self from projection. To grow, the Little Prince must leave behind the illusion of perfect love and journey into the wider world. This is the same process many undergo in their path of individuation, learning that love is not merely the fulfillment of longing, but a confrontation with the whole of another being, light and shadow alike. The rose also symbolizes the fragility of relationships. She is vulnerable, exposed to the elements, dependent on protection. This reflects how, in our inner lives, the aspects of love and beauty are often fragile, needing care and responsibility. It is not enough to admire the rose. One must nurture her, accept her thorns, and recognize her needs. What does a rose teach us? That love is never one-dimensional. It is at once the source of our greatest joy and our deepest wounds. It awakens the highest potential of the soul, yet also confronts us with our darkest fears. For the little prince, the rose is a symbol of his awakening to the complexity of love, a recognition that to truly love, one must embrace not only beauty but also fragility, not only sweetness but also thorns. In this way, the rose is not simply a flower on a distant asteroid. She is an eternal symbol of the paradox of love, to hold beauty and suffering in the same hand, to accept the whole, and in doing so, to grow beyond the illusions of perfection. As the little prince visits various planets, he encounters a series of inhabitants, each a mirror of human tendencies and the limitations of the ego. In my view, these characters are archetypal representations of psychological patterns that imprison the human soul when consciousness is limited or unbalanced. The king represents the archetype of authority and control. He is obsessed with power, yet his kingdom is empty and his commands are meaningless. Psychologically, he reflects the ego that craves dominance and recognition, yet fails to realize that true power comes from inner authority and self-knowledge, not external validation. The vain man embodies the archetype of self-obsession. He seeks admiration above all else, dependent entirely on others to validate his worth. Here we see the ego enslaved by the need for approval, the fragile self that cannot exist without external mirrors. Jung would interpret this as a shadow of narcissism, the inability to integrate self-love and self-respect internally. The drunkard symbolizes avoidance and escapism. He drinks to forget, trapped in a cycle of shame and self-punishment. In Jungian terms, this is the ego's attempt to flee from awareness of its own shadow and responsibilities. It demonstrates how unconscious tendencies can dominate the psyche when one refuses to confront inner conflicts. The businessman, obsessed with counting stars and claiming them as his own, embodies the archetype of materialism and obsessive rationality. He loses sight of life's deeper meaning, reducing the world to numbers and possessions. Psychologically, he illustrates a mind dominated by logos at the expense of anima, imagination, and emotional richness. The geographer, focused on mapping but never exploring, is the archetype of knowledge divorced from experience. He represents the intellect that observes without engaging, planning without living, knowing without understanding. Jung would see this as a warning. Consciousness must be embodied, integrated with feeling and experience, not merely conceptualized. In encountering these figures, the little prince learns the limitations of ego-driven life. Each inhabitant illustrates a form of psychological imbalance, a path in which humans can become trapped if they identify only with one aspect of themselves: authority, vanity, avoidance, material obsession, or detached intellect. Jung would suggest that these planetary visits are symbolic of the journey of individuation. The ego must recognize its projections and illusions before it can integrate with the self. The little prince, in his innocence and wisdom, sees these flaws not with judgment but with clarity, reflecting a higher awareness that transcends the narrow confines of the ego. This section of the story teaches a profound lesson. We must confront the archetypes within ourselves, acknowledge our shadows, and embrace our wholeness. The planets are not merely distant worlds. They are inner landscapes, symbolic of the ways in which human consciousness can become fragmented or constrained. Ultimately, the journey through these planets mirrors the inner psychological work necessary for growth. By observing, reflecting, and integrating, the ego can expand and the soul can move toward wholeness. The Little Prince's journey is thus not just a tale of adventure, but a guide to understand the architecture of the psyche and the universal patterns that shape human experience. One of the most enigmatic figures in The Little Prince is the Serpent, a creature both frightening and strangely compelling. From a Jungian perspective, the serpent embodies profound symbols of the unconscious, transformation, and inevitable encounter with death. Unlike the literal fear it evokes, the serpent represents a psychological threshold, a passage necessary for the soul to mature. In myths across cultures, the serpent has long symbolized renewal, the cyclical nature of life, and hidden wisdom. In the story, the serpent's words are simple yet profound. He promises liberation, not destruction. Psychologically, this can be understood as the confrontation with the unknown within the self. To meet the serpent is to face the shadow, the unconscious forces that have been repressed or ignored. Death, in Jungian thought, is not solely an end but a transition, a transformative process that allows for regeneration. The Little Prince's encounter with the serpent is an allegory for the necessary release of old forms, attachments, and illusions. It is the acknowledgement that growth requires letting go, even when that letting go is frightening or uncertain. The act of transformation is central to individuation. Just as the ego must encounter and integrate the shadow, the soul must confront the inevitability of loss and change. The serpent represents this bridge between the known and the unknown, life and death, consciousness and unconscious. It invites the Little Prince, and by extension the reader, to embrace the flow of existence rather than cling to static comfort. Moreover, the serpent is a teacher of psychological humility. By symbolizing forces beyond human control, it reminds us that the journey of the soul is guided not merely by intellect or desire, but by the rhythms of the unconscious. True wisdom lies in recognizing our limitations while engaging courageously with transformation. The Little Prince's willingness to engage with the serpent demonstrates his readiness for psychological growth. He accepts the necessity of change in the mysterious cycle of life. In Jungian terms, this is a profound moment of integration. The conscious self acknowledges the unconscious, the ego encounters a shadow, and the soul begins to embrace wholeness. Death and transformation are inseparable from the pursuit of meaning. In the story, the serpent facilitates a passage from innocence to insight, from attachment to understanding, and from fear to acceptance. This mirrors the psychological reality that growth often requires confronting that which is unknown, uncomfortable, or seemingly final. Ultimately, the serpent is not a threat, but a guide. It embodies the transformative potential of the unconscious, reminding us that true individuation demands courage, surrender, and faith in the processes of life. For the Little Prince, this encounter is both terrifying and necessary, symbolizing the profound lessons that lie in embracing the full spectrum of existence. As we reach the conclusion of The Little Prince, the story becomes a profound allegory for individuation, the central process of psychological development I have described throughout my work. Individuation is a path by which the human psyche integrates its conscious and unconscious aspects, acknowledges a shadow, and moves toward wholeness. The journey of the Little Prince exemplifies this process in symbolic form. Throughout his travels, the Little Prince encounters figures who embody limitations of the ego: the king, the vain man, the drunkard, the businessman, and the geographer. He meets his rose, the projection of love, frailty, and the shadow, and confronts the ultimate transformation represented by the serpent. Each encounter is a reflection of inner psychological dynamics, providing lessons that guide him and us toward deeper self-understanding. The prince's eventual return to his asteroid is not a retreat, but completion of a cycle. In Jungian terms, it symbolizes the integration of experiences, a reconciliation between the ego and the self. He has seen the limitations of superficial existence. He has recognized the duality of love and loss, and he has encountered the transformative forces of life and death. Now, he is prepared to embody these lessons fully, embracing both the light and shadow within himself. Psychologically, the story teaches that growth requires courage and reflection, to confront our shadows, to acknowledge impermanence, and to embrace the full complexity of relationships in the world is to step onto the path of individuation. The Little Prince's innocence is preserved not as naivety, but as wisdom. He retains the clarity, openness, and curiosity of the child archetype while engaging with profound truths of existence. The narrative also highlights the importance of interconnection. The aviator, who witnesses the prince's journey, is transformed by it. This reflects the relational nature of the psyche, Our encounters with archetypal figures, whether internal or external, guide our development. Each person, each challenge, each symbolic event serves as a mirror to our unconscious, inviting reflection, growth, and integration. The final lesson of The Little Prince is that true understanding cannot be rushed or forced. Individuation unfolds gradually, often through symbols, stories, and encounters that illuminate unconscious patterns. The prince's journey is a metaphor for the inner work we must all undertake. To see clearly, to love fully, and to reconcile all parts of self, including those that are hidden or feared. Ultimately, The Little Prince is a story about the eternal dance between the conscious ego and the unconscious self, a reminder that growth and wholeness are achieved by embracing complexity rather than seeking simplicity. For readers, Jung would emphasize the invitation to honor the child within, to confront the shadow, and to move courageously through life's transformations. In doing so, we approach the fullness of human potential, a life rich with meaning, understanding, and psychological wholeness. The story is timeless because it speaks not just to children, but to the adult soul. And in reflecting upon it, we learn that individuation is not a destination, but a journey, and that the wisdom of the Little Prince can guide us toward a deeper connection with our own inner worlds.